Dave Rajewski is director of the Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program. Heather Chaplin is director of the Journalism and Design program at the New School. They join us to discuss addressing complexity with playable models, which sounds jargony, so maybe we should start with a little description of what it is we're talking about. What are we talking about? What kind of complexity and what is a playable model?
Well, I'll take the complexity part,
Okay.
and you can do the playable. I think the thing that brought Heather and I together, and we're from different spaces, she's from the journalism space, I obviously work in a large think tank, was this feeling that we're dealing with incredibly complex problems. If we wander around the Wilson Center, we're dealing with energy, or cybersecurity, climate change. There are complex problems attached to complex problems. Some people call these wicked problems. They're problems that are very difficult to predict to trying to figure out what the outcomes are going to be. And I think one of the things that struck me is we're dealing with these very nonlinear problems in very linear ways. Mm-hmm. We're putting words after words, long sentences together. And I think it's very difficult to actually engage people and sustain engagement over a long period of time, and also to do that in a way that's scalable. So one of the things that we're interested in is how do we actually scale engagement around these complex problems to 5,000, 10,000, 5 million people. And that's what brought us to this idea of what can we learn from interactive media, from the game industry, and how can we take some of this complexity, unpack it, and make it in a way that's essentially exploratory.
I think proponents of comic books will use the term graphic novel because it's more respectable. Is playable model a more respectable version of video game?
Partly, but I actually think it's more profound than that. Just the quick backstory is I covered video games for a very long time, so I'm a journalist. And the thing that kept me around the video game space that got me super interested was this thinking that started emerging, I guess, in the mid to late 2000s, which is what is a video game and what kind of skills and dispositions in the people who play them is it fostering? And to me, the most interesting thing to come out of that was that a video game itself is a complex dynamic system like Dave has just been talking about. So this idea emerged that when you are playing a video game, you're actually engaging with the processes of a system directly in a way that you aren't when you read a novel or you watch a movie. And so how can we take that thing that's happening and translate it into some of the complex problems we face, like climate change or income inequality? And the reason that we talk about playable models or this idea of exploratory journalism is a game has a win state. Right? So a game is you start here and we're leading you towards something. But the reason we kind of backed away from the term game is what if we instead gave people a system of something in the news, so the system behind the headline that you see, but the system that led to the headline, and we created something that you could play with. There's a lot of research about play, and play is a very open psychological state. When people are playing, they are open to new ideas and new experiences in a way that they're just not when you tell them something.
And it's the way we learn initially in life.
Play is how primates learn, exactly. And I think for me, these values map very nicely over the values of journalism, which is supposed to be the sort of objective, I mean, let's not get into a whole thing about subjective objectivity, but it's supposed to be like, here are the facts, you decide. So I was really attracted to the idea that, like, if you build these models, of course there's values built in and everything, but you're transparent as possible. You give them to people to play with an understanding that you don't know what conclusions necessarily they're going to come to, but they will have explored the system in a more meaningful way than you could do in a linear story.
Let's take a specific example or a specific application, and maybe that will be a better way for us to dig through it rather than staying in the general. So you mentioned several things. You mentioned climate change. The global banking system would be a very complex. Airlines are a great example of one problem at one airline has a ripple effect around the globe. You can pick one. Tell us which would be a good one where the playable model paradigm could work.
The one that we used here, we developed was the budget game, the National Budget
Hero,
which was up for about 4 years. We're getting ready to do a new release. It's built on very complex models. These are the models that are sitting at the Congressional Budget Office. Lots of data. These are the sort of things that actually inform decisions, hopefully in the Congress and the executive branch. But I think one of the things that struck me when we did it was I thought maybe 100,000 people would play this. I mean, playing with a budget is not something that's inherently interesting. We had well over 2 million games played over a course of 4 years. And that was an old technology. But I think the thing that was interesting is instead of saying to people, here's the solution to the budget, we said, okay, you're going to get all the data and the models that makers are using, and you come up with your own solution. And I think there's a bigger issue here is I think that this is part of what I would call sort of deliberate participation. That's a key part of our democracy. This is not giving people solutions or sort of saying, here, we figured this out for you. It's saying this is something that's really important in your life. How the government spends all of your taxpayer dollars is important. You play around with it and come up with your own solutions.
And then it unveils things like unintended consequences. You might be strong on cutting certain areas of the budget, but then you see the implications of that.
So my dream, I think as a policy person, was always I wanted sort of a flight simulator.
Yes.
For policymaking. I wanted to be able to have people test hypotheses and fail. This gets back to your idea of playing, because you learn incredible amounts when you can do hypothesis testing.
There's a Congress joke or two in there, but I will resist about failing. But Heather, for a journalist, is this a useful model? In other words, you raised the question of, you raised the point about how surprised you were for how many people ended up playing in Budget Hero. So the question is, you've covered gamers and the gaming industry. Are they the people who will play these games, or is it a different audience altogether?
That's a good question. I mean, I would hope that it's a much broader audience. I mean, my dream for this would be that this is just something the New York Times is always doing, and BuzzFeed is always doing, and Vox is always doing, that a playable model or this idea of a more exploratory form of journalism just becomes another tool in journalists' tool belt of, hey, here's a story. Wait, this story is really complex. Let's not assign someone to write an 800-word fact to fact to fact to fact linear story. Let's build a little simulation. Let's build a model of it, put a play layer on top, and give it with people to explore for themselves.
And the nature of a nonlinear platform is that you can build a playable model that is accessible for a journalist, a policymaker, general public, varying levels of knowledge.
And that's something we definitely talked about is, could this be something that journalists used to educate themselves about issues they were covering, or would it be the end product that went to the user? I mean, I think there's a lot of potential applications once you start looking into this.
I think the other thing that occurred, at least with the budget game, is that the data coming out of the game itself became a basis for a narrative. That in the end we ended up with a database of 1 million games in it. A lot of those gameplay decisions were tied to demographic data. So it actually started to feed back into the stories the journalists were telling. Well, look at what came out of the people, 1 million people playing this game. And quite often it was actually different from what the pundits were talking about. So you're kind of crowdsourcing a different journalistic narrative. And I think that's something that we haven't really begun to figure out how to use, either as a policy research institute, or even I think people that work in journalism.
Yeah, to start mining stories for sure.
This book that is available through STIP is the website, wilsoncenter.org. People can get a copy. I was reading it in preparation for this discussion, and a question I'm very fond of when we talk about complex issues like climate change is, how close are we? What is the gap between the nature of the problem and the intended solutions? And you address that directly in one of the phrases that you write in the book. You say that the problems and solution gap is large. So where are we on the spectrum here of applying playable models as a tool to understand these complex systems versus the amount of complex systems that there are to understand?
I mean, I think the thing that we found, we did a lot of interviews to do this, was that there is something inherently subversive about this. That we live in an expert culture, and we're trained to sort of find experts.
And we introduced the word play.
And we introduced the play. And even though a lot of research out there really says that experts are really not much better at predicting the future than a coin flip.
Yeah.
Right.
We keep going back to the same wells. And I think the idea both for think tanks and also for people in the journalism areas, it is quite a I think threatening concept to say, okay, we're not going to give people the solutions, we're going to give them the capacity to develop their own solutions and share those widely. And I think that's part of the pushback that we felt.
Yeah, no, and it really was extraordinary doing these interviews. So what I did was I went around and talked to journalists and sort of media innovators, and how much nervousness there is around this concept of journalism being exploratory. Explainer journalism is very big right now.
Because of less control on the editorial side?
I really think it's an issue of control. And again, to me, it's so timely. I mean, everybody knows, I think, that journalism is going through great upheavals right now, trying to figure out how to stay alive, both from a business model perspective and being relevant to an audience. And I think this issue of no longer being the expert or the gatekeeper of understanding journalism as a much more participatory, even collaborative activity than anyone used to conceive of it before is a huge, it's asking a lot of people who have been in journalism for a long time. And so then you come along and say, hey, put out the news and let people play with it. I mean, that is just, journalism culture is not a particularly playful place.
You mentioned the decision making, and there's a book, Decisive, written by Dan and Chip Heath, that their research indicates that corporations are about as good at making decisions as our teenagers, who are legendarily flawed in their judgment, according to at least car rental industry, right? And what they say is the reason is they don't, when they're a merger and acquisition, for example, they don't consider enough of the alternatives or enough of the potential outcomes. It would sound as if what this does naturally is represent more than any linear platform could dream of.
You obviously, you don't have an infinite scenario space, but you can play with lots of different scenarios. And the other interesting thing that came out of the budget game was I actually found out serendipitously that there was a bunch of people at the Congressional Budget Office that played our game. And I asked them, why would you do that? This is all of
They're
your
willing
data.
to admit that publicly?
Yeah, well, I don't know if they're willing to admit it publicly, but the logic is sort of, we have these large spreadsheets. So essentially, they couldn't play with them. There was no play in it. Right? Even though they had the data in the spreadsheets, the idea of actually being able to go in and play with their data was something that was quite attractive to them. And I'm convinced that playfulness opens up a lot of space, not only for the public, but actually for people in policy-making decision.
A final quick thought. Speaking of complexity, this is more complex than we have time to do justice to it, but we'll revisit it. But are there early adopters? Are there industries or individuals or places that are more primed for this than others?
It's a good question. I'll tackle it from the journalist's perspective. I mean, there was a wave of real interest in games and serious games. And my sense is, after doing these interviews, that sort of petered out. People sort of got sidelined by ideas about gamification, or thinking that games were sort of, that this idea of a news game became the holy grail. And I feel like what we're talking about is actually a little bit different. So I feel like there was this sort of peak of excitement, and then there's been this sort of slow downhill after that. In some ways, what I would say is you have some news organizations that are more playful, and some news organizations that are less playful. And this might seem at first like it doesn't fit exactly, but I think of like the Center for Investigative Reporting. They will do a news story, and then they partner with the local youth poetry collective and have them do poetry slams, or they have somebody do a play based around what they're doing. So is that a playable model? No, but is it a spirit of playfulness and experimentation and sort of being open to, hey, we're not necessarily the experts, we're going to hand it over to the community and see what they do? That feels like it's in line with what we're talking about here.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for joining us, and look forward to see where all this heads. Some of us would like to see more play introduced to the equation, so thank you very much.
Thank you.